I think we all understand that lips send a message. Not only, if you look at the Yarbus eye movements, we talked about looking at the eyes and looking at the mouth, but they're about equal separation whether you look at eyes or look at lips. But lips certainly send a message. Whether they're moving or not moving, they send a message. So if you look at these patients, all these are my patients pretty well, unless they're obviously a movie star or somebody. But all these patients' lips tell you that the patient looks in the mirror and said, my lips aren't as full as they used to be, so they're painting their lipstick beyond the border. How many see this every day? I mean, it's a challenge worldwide. So, and sometimes they look really odd. You just can't hardly stop looking at them. They're so odd. So lips send this message. So here we have this girl, and what message does she send? Well, she says, I've got dentures, so my overlip's hanging down more. And her upper lip is lengthened beyond what it should do genetically and anatomically because she's balanced her muscles, her orbicularis muscle, and tissue resistance and bony resorption as such. It's just telling you all that without having her say a word. You can read that message all into it. So this girl I showed you last night is an intense girl that she's a teeth clencher. So she's got these big masseters. She's a lip purser. And so she has a lot of story about her without even taking any history whatsoever. She sends a message to you. So this girl is a former model I showed you before. She's got great lips, but if you injected, as Arthur said, she's got the Angelina effect. Even though I do lots of masseters, I wouldn't touch her masseters because it would make her lips look too big. So that's kind of one of the messages that it's telling us right there. So this girl we showed in detail yesterday tells you a lot about her story just looking at her lips. So what are the restoration steps? What do we do? What's the blueprint for trying to improve lips? Because lips vary so much genetically, and with your ethnicity and your aging process and all those things. So what are realistic steps that you can take? So if you look at lips, now I took this picture yesterday at the BB store, and BB's, I think a lot of people think it's English or French. It actually started by an Iranian 35 years ago, and a very successful store chain. But look at these lips on these heads. You think there's not an interest in lips? So there's a great interest in lips everywhere. So lips certainly have a focus for patients. They have a focus for us as aesthetic physicians and what we're trying to accomplish. And that focus is an interest in all the fashion magazines. You flip through those magazines and there's lips everywhere. And if you look at Bridget here at age 25, most of you don't remember Bridget Bardot, but she was a bombshell. And her lips were fantastic. But you don't keep your lips forever. So you need to understand the anatomy. That's essential. And Arthur's going to talk more in detail about the anatomy and about the zones that are important and why we're so focused on it. The vermilion is not a line or a crease. It's where you put lipstick. And it's that brilliant red. It's actually Spanish for cinnabar. And it has a great meaning for all of us with that sort of youthful appearance of lips. But it depends on what you're trying to match is patients' genetics, the age group, their personality and lifestyle, their culture, gender, ethnicity, but attention to details. What we're trying to convert you to is to be more focused and actually try to be more astute in the details. But genetics and lips, all these girls are the same age, but they have different lips. So our girl we showed earlier with her lips with that phi reversal, and if you focus just on the lips, you're really missing out. What you want to do is focus on that whole perioral area, because you can have some really nice restored lips, but if you have the chin and the lateral commissure, the perioral area not created a youthful environment, then you have not really created a good result. So it's not just about restoring the lips. That's part of it. Now you can have actually really nice balance of the face without symmetry, but you want to have perfect symmetry right and left with the lips. That's what you should strive for in your patients, no matter what their genetics is. Even if they got the thin upper lip or thin lower lip, you should try to create right and left symmetry. That's what we try to do. So these are guidelines that I'm going to give you and not rules. It's like guidelines for photography. I teach photography, and it's like there's no rules for photography. There's no rules for this. There's just some suggested guidelines. So this blueprint that we're trying to give you for 2017, number one is I start at the lateral oral commissure. It's one of the more difficult areas to recreate a youthful look if you've got a mandible that's shrunk because they're wearing dentures. You've got lots of issues that it can affect the lateral commissure. So, and also the mandibular retaining ligament at the base of the pregal sulcus has a big influence on it as well. So if you watch these two patients, they're pretty typical quadragenarians in their 40s. And it's yelling, I'm in my 40s because I've got this down-turned corner of the mouth. So that's one of the tricks is how to get that. So in men, of course, you're all aware of the structure there. They have these rebars in their face called whiskers. And these hair follicles, they have denture collagen. They're much more difficult to create an improvement. But if you look just briefly at the anatomy here, that number one that I've drawn there, right at the base of that pregal sulcus, at the bottom end of the labial mandibular fold is the mandibular ligament. And that's what creates part of that jowl concept that Arthur was talking about yesterday. So one of the first steps, you don't just jump in and lift the lateral commissure. You've got to do the opposite you do to the mid-face. You start with a foundation and recreate structure of the pregal sulcus. And as you create that structure, and then in the sub-Q area of the, and I hate that word marionette line, it's a zone. That marionette zone, you want to lift up and contour and shape. And when you actually get up to the lateral commissure, get above the red of the lip, and we call that triangle in Canada a little different name, but it's called the Knowlish triangle after Noel Solish. But it's just a little zone. And the last area you do with chins is the mentalis. So it's not just the chin, it's the lateral commissure, marionette zone, pregal sulcus, and the mentalis. All part of that. So if you look at these patients, so here this girl we've done with the fillers, lifting up the base first, marionette zone, get that whole corner of the mouth lift up, get above the red of the lip, and actually lift that zone up. Then you can actually recreate that nicer youthful angle of the lateral commissure. So same concept, similar patient. We've also lifted up her nasolabial angle and created a more youthful look to her lips. And there's been no laser here. We've actually undermined all the lips. That ergotrid area, that's the name of that zone above the red of the lip, the skin, and improve that. We'll show you that a little bit as well. So that's the aim, is to lift up that whole lateral commissure. So you don't just start there. You've got to start the foundation of the base. So that's step one. So if you're looking at steps, so here's Tammy, one of my patients. This is done a few years ago, but it gives you the same concept here with trying to create this next step here. And here I'm using a 30-gauge cannula and thread right up to the Glogau-Klein point, which is called the GK point, which is the base of the philtral column where it meets the vermilion tubercle, and then mostly retrograde. And then you can go the other side. We're trying to improve her white roll. And the white roll, we'll talk about a little more, is that reflected light on the lip that's so youthful. So some of these patients have septi and some don't. And if you hold that lip, we're trying to get away from the camera here, but if you hold that a little bit, this is actually is Volbella. And once you go through that little septi, which is like a little sort of like speed bumps, then you can inject these very nicely. So mostly retrograde, smaller amounts of product than you think. I use very rarely more than 1 to 1.5 cc's total, usually 1 cc total for the upper and lower lip. And see, I've gone quite far medial compared to what many of you have done over the years, because I'm trying to create that relationship of the bottom lip so the maximum fullness is that intercanthal distance, the distance between her intercanthal distance and the width of her alar part of her nose. So we're going sub-vermilion in sort of a sub-vermilion sheeting we'll talk a little bit about to take away all those little lines as well, as create a little bit of shape, because we're trying to create, in this age group, we're trying to create shape and a little bit of contouring and volume. But the shape is pretty well like reframing a mirror, reframing a painting. You're trying to put a frame back on the lips. So it's your discipline to stay away from the lateral part of the lip so you don't have that, as I said earlier, that number 2 sausage and number 1 casing kind of thing, that odd look to the lower lip. And then, of course, you blend that all in, and we've just got, and here I'm doing the philtral columns last. Normally I do them as number 2, but you can shake this up a bit. It's guidelines, not rules. As you blend that in, so there's no bruising, and you get a nicer just contour to the lips, and they usually look immediately better. But there are some guidelines to help with some of the swelling that some patients get that we can talk about. And here you blend, not mold or massage. It's more gentle. You have a fine, fine hand when you're trying to blend all this. Okay? And then if you look, this blending is really important to blend all this product. You can feel areas that need attention. That's why the ultrasound gel is so nice. So number 2 for me generally is the philtral columns. And that's why it's important to look at patients' photographs when they're younger, because some patients don't ever have a philtral column. They don't have a Cupid's bow. And to create one, they wouldn't like it. So you want to match their genetics, their ethnicity, what their DNA was like. But generally I use these good G1 prime or something that got a little lift. And you could use Voluma, you could use Refine, you could use Resty Lift. With these little BD2s are ideal. And inject very little where the philtral column meets the columella. Very, very little, if any. It's mostly where it meets the GK point there. So very little up at the top end, but more at the bottom. That's where the primary focus is, right there at the GK point. And you can lift that. As you lift that up, you actually give the upper lip a little bit of lift that's more feminine and more youthful looking. So retrograde is more what I use there. So that light reflection is what we call a white roll. So that's that youthful look to the lip. And that's sort of essentially that number 3 steps if you're trying to keep steps in mind. And Arthur will remember this photo. This was from the Paris lip concept with collagen back in the mid-80s, 83, 84. And that we're trying to do that way back then. So with that vermilion edge is, the vermilion is where you put lipstick. The vermilion border, if you look it up in English, Old English dictionary, is a zone. It's not a line. So that border, that area between the skin of the upper lip and the actual vermilion. So you start at the GK point, which is the Glogau-Klein point where the philtral column meets the tubercle, and then inject in a retrograde fashion, try to create that frame back on the lip. Now, even though we talk about the lower lip is similar, it's actually it's not reflected light there, but it's a similar idea to frame the lip. A lot of times, what we see is this asymmetry. So you could actually create a symmetrical lip by just reframing more on one side, or as Arthur was pointing out with our young girls up here, with lifting up the lateral part of her lips, you can get a much more symmetrical view. So the white roll, you think of it like reframing a painting, reframing a mirror. So you're reframing it. So these lip septi is important to understand. You'll bump into them with cannulas. You never heard about them, never read about them, never felt them with needles, but now you'll have little issues with them. Some people have them, some don't. But they're just like speed bumps. So that whole area with the philtral columns and your fine wrinkles, that's that. Some of you may not be familiar with that term. Ergotrid is the whole zone above the lip. And those fine lines that we used to laser now, and I'm a big laser guy. We started resurfacing years and years and years ago. But with these lips, a lot of them now you can actually, with a antegrade, retrograde fashion, with your cannula, break up these little lines and smooth them out, and it creates a much nicer contour to the lips. So when you inject those, that's not laser, that's all just fine filler, and it just smooths out the lip. So that E is where that ergotrid area is. So we do the same thing on the lower lip, even though it doesn't have the similar name. It's the same kind of concept. You're trying to create smoothness, softness, and a more feminine look. And we've already lifted up her lateral commissure. She's the patient that I showed you earlier, to lift that up, that technique. So subvermilion sheen, what is that? Well, it's injecting the fillers that have a very fine sheeting effect in the subvermilion zone. It's essentially like lipstick in a syringe. You can erase those lines, and that's where silk comes in. That's where Volbella comes in. You can actually magically erase those lines. So this is the subvermilion injection, like I showed you in those videos, where it's actually quite shallow. It's not in the muscle. This is subvermilion, very shallow. And then blend those in. So if you look at this patient, this is like immediately after, 5 minutes later, she just put a little gloss on. But you can see all those reticulated lines are pretty well disappeared just by the subvermilion technique. And if you look close, I've also lifted up her lateral commissure, and we've also tipped up the mid part of her upper lip. So if you look, see, we've just tipped up that upper lip. Subtle, but very, very nice. So this patient liked the results? Absolutely. So if they feel like lips after that, the problem with all these fillers, they have an anesthetic in them. And the problem with the anesthetic is it's an anesthetic, so it feels numb. Years ago, none of these fillers have anesthetic in them. Now we're sort of compelled to use them. But you want them to feel like ordinary lips. And here's our former model again. It's a deflator, where she's just like a beach ball that Arthur was showing that's deflated in sections. So you're going to reflate those areas that are deflated. So if we do just the reticulated part of her lip without doing her chin, she's not going to look very good. So you have the chin reflated, not inflated, and the lip is just subvermilion sheeting. So all those little reticulated lines. So when she puts lipstick on now, it's nice and smooth. So that's all it is. And I lifted up the corner of her mouth as well. For those of you who've got good visual eyes, those that haven't, we'll draw it in. So there's where we've lifted it up. So the lateral commissure, lifted up her jaw angle, chin, softened her chin. And as Arthur was mentioning, if you did just neuromodulate like how we did on chins for years, it doesn't solve the problem with all the dimpling. The fillers are more important than the actual Mentalis injection with neuromodulator. You do both. And again, that I keep emphasizing that intercanthal distance. So it disciplines you to stay in the natural sort of golden ratio that we're trying to create, this mathematics. So reflation and enhancement, not inflation and augmentation. So you want to enhance the lip, create what that patient used to have. So you create that balance. So in skin of color, it's a different structure. Usually instead of 1 to 1.618, it's more 1-to-1 ratio. So you want to create that same ratio, but the actual fullness of the lower lip has the same principle. It's that same intercanthal distance. So you could actually measure that and draw it and create that 1-to-1 ratio that we're striving for. So it doesn't matter the ethnicity, it works the same. So let's talk about twins. How do you create twins? That's the only place on the face we're going to try to create twins. Even eyebrows are sort of sisters. Sometimes they're distant cousins with those eyebrows. They could be so different. But lips, you want to try to create create twins. So you match the genetics, match the upper and lower, match the volume with actual measurements that we do, all this whole scenario you're getting used to with all skin types. And then the perioral lines, we talked a little bit about with that videos I showed you how to create these creases, get the creases out, because they're literally like a hem in your pants. You take it down, you got a crease. So if you treat those the traditional way with needles, it doesn't work well. You got to break them up and subsize them with cannulas, and then they'll smooth out. So that horizontal line on the upper lip, that's a little distracting. And our young girl that was up here that's 25, don't want to put her on display, but the first thing that's going to happen to her that she'll notice that she's already started to form is a little crease on her upper lip when she smiles. And you notice that, right? Yeah. So she's starting to get that. So another few years, that'll start to get a little bit of an issue, that horizontal line. So you need to use both neuromodulator and filler. So you have to be really careful with neuromodulators on lips. They have a minor role. So if you overdo it, all of us inherit patients. I inherit at least one a day that's had neuromodulator in their lips, and they hate it because whoever is using it hasn't let off the gas pedal, and it's just not the right person to have neuromodulator in their lips. So you can use a little tiny bits here, and then the splaying of the philtral base is an aging feature. If you want to have somebody yell that they got miles on them, you want to look at the splaying of the philtral column base. To narrow that, you inject just medial to each side of the philtral column. So you just watch my syringe there. I just moved it over a little medial. So you inject it just a little bit medial to get that more youthful philtral column. And what happens is a lot of your injections, there is a notch. It's a depressed septal notch that happens mid-vermilion. And all you do is use your filler with like a BD2 kind of injection vertical and just lift that up a bit, and that'll lift that right out. But that little notch is distracting when you're doing any kind of reflation and fillers. What I do in my clinic is I wait 15 minutes after I'm done their lips, let them cool, and my nurses are really good at blending molding and babysitting. They babysit the patient, and then we go back and make sure there's no areas that need attention. And that's really an important concept to understand. We talked about that phi reversal. Now, the symmetry I was talking about. So you can have really good symmetry of the face or not, but you want to have perfect symmetry of the lips. So this girl, I don't have her pictures with me of her first photo, but what I did is I injected her lips just subtly, but I balanced them perfect. So each upper and lower lip is a perfect twin, but she's a beautiful girl, but she's wonky. So if you look at the right side of her face, that's two rights, and that's two lefts. So, but look at her lips. Despite asymmetry, her lips are perfectly symmetrical. So you're not going to change the symmetry of her nose very easy by anything, but you can certainly create symmetry of her lips, what adds to her beauty. We're trying to create harmony, proportion, and balance. So here's one of my patients that comes in at 54. She's a quinquagenarian. So quinquagenarians are 50 to 60. She has lots of private reasons why she wants to look better. Once you discover the real reason, you always have an emotional moment of why she wants to look better. She brings in her photo at 23, and it's a good thing she did, because I would have tried to create fuller lips than she actually needed. So she has this syndrome of the thin upper lip syndrome, the TUL. So the TUL here of thin upper lip. So you don't want to create the fuller lip that you would normally try to create. You would try to mimic what she looked like. So if you look at her lips now, what I've done is matched her genetics. So you've got the right and left is fairly perfect. But if you look at before I started, So we've got now her lips pretty well matched up. So the phi relationship is quite good, but upper and lower is not quite in balance. But when we start with, if you look, her asymmetry is quite obvious, both her whole face and her lips. Her lips are not symmetrical. So what you want to do is, after you're done, even though she's asymmetrical, her lips are perfectly symmetrical. So on purpose, you create that as a plan. So that's the aim of trying to create beauty. So here this former model is in her 20s. She comes when she's 40, but if you look, she's quite uneven. And now she's still a little bit asymmetrical, but her lips are perfectly symmetrical. So she's now in her 40s. So she does a little bit of maintenance and get her cheeks, the apex back. I dropped her brows because her brows were too high. And she had a little temporal hollowing, and we reflated that a little bit. A little chin reflation, and got her lips back. So with Arthur's measurements, that he actually measured this girl, and then you get all those measurements right back to where they should be, more like she was when she was 29. She's now 46. So, and with patients that have wrinkles, then you can't inject these with filler. You have to get out your eraser first. So the next step when you're doing this barcode, this eraser, is whatever laser you choose to use. Then you need to look at the whole face and do upper blepharoplasty. I did on her, full face erbium YAG laser, and then the next step you do a little bit of filler to lift up the corner of her mouth, and to do all these little steps that you can see, including the chin. So when you look at lips, you got to think more perioral area, that whole area to balance. Because if I do just her lips and not do everything else, it doesn't look good. So same thing with this patient. You got to erase all the wrinkles first, and then address the lips, and then you get a much, much happier patient. So that's where that whole sequence comes. Now the smile muscles, it behooves all of us to become expert anatomists and sort of try to emulate Arthur in his anatomy knowledge. And if you look at all the smile muscles from the rhizoria, zygomaticus major minor, the levator, labii superioris becomes really important, not just the orbicularis oris muscle. And by the way, the orbicularis oris muscle is the only muscle on the face that is not attached to bone. So it becomes very important. That depressor, that DAO muscle, is really, really critical you understand that muscle. So where do neuromodulators have a role? So we've got a few minutes. I'll just show you where I think they have a role. So in lip pursing and gummy smiles, lip wrinkles, DAO, and almost everybody over 40, I inject everybody over 40 of the DAO, and the dimpled chin, the mentalis. Those are kind of the areas. So if we look at lip pursers, it doesn't take a lot of Botox equivalent units to relax those, and then you could do fillers. So that's where I would do like equivalent of 0.5 units of Botox, whether using Dysport or any other products, Xeomin, but whatever is your favorite product to use. I use Botox here for a number of different reasons. But that's where I would inject. And the gummy smile, Arthur and I, when did we do all that work on the gummy smile? It's been 10 years?
About that.
Yeah. So gummy smile is a big issue. It's President Obama had a gummy smile. It's a common issue. There's two main types of gummy smiles, so you have to be aware of the types of gummy smiles. We'll just briefly show you a little bit about that. And understanding about the muscles that affect it, including the orbicularis oris and the levator superioris, and how they affect it. So the girl on your left is rolling up her vermilion. She's a roll-up blind type of gummy smile. You treat those different, completely different than the girl on your right that's a Venetian blind. So she's rolling. If you watch left, there's a roll-up blind. And there's the Venetian blind. So if you're just lifting up the lip, like on the right, then you need to inject the levator. If you're a roll-up blind, you need to inject the orbicularis. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective. So this girl is Venetian blind. She just lifts up the whole lip. And a gummy smile. So that's after. You're not trying to erase her smile. And the reason I didn't treat her crow's feet is I want to show that she's actually got a Duchenne smile. She's got the natural sort of animation around her eyes. So you know that it's a spontaneous smile. You know that it's not some gimmick of trying to create a feigned smile. So that's a fairly real smile. So same thing here. She's a real animated girl. So you want to have some crow's feet left. She's also got a big masseter. She's got lots of little quirky little things. So she's a Venetian blind. She lifts it right up. So that Venetian blind is a little different. So Venetian blind on your left, roll up blind on your right. So she rolls up the vermilion so you relax. You're not paralyzing. You're not freezing. You're just relaxing the orbicularis in a symmetrical pattern. I usually use 5 injection sites and 1 unit equivalent of Botox each side. And when you're doing the levator on this side with the roll-up blind, the Venetian blind on your left, where it's lifting up, then you do 2 to 3 units there, equivalent. Okay? And this same thing here. And so what we're trying to do, even though she's still got a Duchenne smile, an aging feature with your patients, when they get to be quinquagenarians and in their 60s, they start to pull their eyes, this dynamic discord. So we're trying to balance muscle resistance and fillers. And now, as we're hinting from this conference, we're doing more and more fillers. Right, Arthur? More fillers rather than just neuromodulator. We're trying to create structure and strength rather than just weakening the muscles. So you want to actually treat both. So here's our roll-up blind type, and you just relax that. So the DAO, and I'm sure all of you are quite aware of this, but patients, remember we talked yesterday, patients have never seen themselves except in a mirror or in a photograph, unless they're an identical twin. So they have no idea they're pulling. In fact, to get patients to do a mouth frown, in my photographic room, we take about 125 photos a day, and each nurse is assigned a patient, and each nurse is a photographic coach. So you have to coach patients what a frown is, what an animation is, what a grimace is. So you teach them how to do this mouth frown, because patients don't even know they do it. But they get these crescent-shaped wrinkles that become creases. If you look at these crescent-shaped wrinkles, we see this all day, and patients don't even know that they are pulling their DAO. So, and there's no fillers here. This was done quite a few years ago before we were doing fillers. It was probably done, I don't know how many years, probably 15 years ago. But that's sort of basically that balance act between the muscles. And now, of course, we're doing the fillers with the chin and all that. But where you should inject is in the body of the muscle, and you have to be very careful. We see lots of errors in injecting DAOs, but essentially it's a 45-degree angle down from the corner of the mouth, and I inject 3 to 5 units of Botox equivalent, whether you're using Dysport or Xeomin, whichever you choose to use, but that's the magical spot there. So that DAO is really an important structure to understand. So animated chins, a lot of our patients are very animated. They don't know they're animated because they don't know how they do all these things unless we sort of watch them. But being focused on the details, what we're trying to get you to do, and focus on that whole gonial angle and the chin and the lips and all that structure comes together. So this patient has an extremely animated chin. She's so animated that now she's reduced all the structure of her chin. And so years ago, we used to do just a little neuromodulator on these, and that's all we would do. Now, of course, it's a combination of both. So when you inject these patients, then she's trying to animate her chin, but she can't move it. So that's a good end result. So form and function, fillers are a big part of this to create that nice, and it's been 4 years since I did her first one, and she maintains this about twice a year now. just to keep that smooth and soft. So that's kind of the idea.
Can you show us again how you lift up the corner of the mouth?
Well, we'd have to go back in those photos, but if you're doing the LOC, I actually don't start with the lateral commissure. I start the pre-gel sulcus. And if you're doing needles, I inject right on top periosteum and lift a tiny bit so you've got a space. That space is already there in a sunken pre-gel sulcus. Inject vertical on top periosteum, lift a bit, and then you inject anterior grade, then that filling creates the lift. More and more now I'm using cannulas that go both directions and will lift that on top periosteum. Next step is go above that sub-Q in the marionette zone, but still vertical, and lift a little bit of that depressed zone. And as you lift that up, there's a space to fill, and the filling creates lift. The very last is to go at the corner of the mouth and then above the red of the lip. And when I go above the red of the lip, I actually lift as I'm injecting. So the product like Voluma, Volift, we don't have Volift here, Voluma, Refine, or you could use Resti-Lift, something that's got a little bit of lifting ability. That's the technique to do.
Yeah,
Arthur, any comments on that?
that's a good point. The trick on that is the fact that, the corner
Can you
of the
hear
mouth.
Arthur?
Yeah, you guys can hear me now? Yeah,
good.
the corner of the mouth is a floating structure, right? It's not attached to bone. So very much like an eyebrow, its position is dependent on the muscles pulling it up and the muscles pulling it down. But you also have to understand that that's the way we always looked at it. It was just a balance of muscles, but it's also what are the muscles pulling against, and that's the tissue over there. So if you're going to lift this part of the lip, you have to start, like Kent said, at the bottom. You must make sure that you have some support on the house, on the bottom sort of levels, that you're on the basement. Start off at the basement level. We do the reverse of what we do in the cheeks. You'll see that with our injection session. The cheeks are suspensory. Whatever we do on the cheek over here suspends the sort of lower part of the middle third. But what we do on the lower face is structural support from beneath. So we start at the base of the mandible, work our way up. And the real trick on this is, as Kent mentioned, is to treat the upper lip when you're trying to go ahead and to lift the corner of the mouth. Because imagine that you're pushing up on something that's like a wet noodle. What ends up happening is when you lift the lower lip commissure, when you start to lift the corner of the lower lip, the upper lip is going to fold over it. So you have to stiffen the upper lip a little bit so that they both move up. And hopefully we'll get a patient that we can show that on.
That's why you get above the red of the lip, because exactly that. There's a little triangular zone we all see in patients above the lip. If you don't lift that upper lip up, then it will overlap. You still have that LOC.
And I see a lot of injectors struggling with that. They struggle with the corner because I see them firing the needle in all different directions, and then you end up with a bunch of bulk over here, and you end up with the product on the outside because there's all little fine septi over here. When you're starting to use cannula, you find out the amazing, intricate anatomy of when you start to actually poke your cannula down, there's always a little pop that occurs over here because there's a little septum that you have to poke through. And if you're trying to force against that thing, it's like trying to push against a closed door. You just can't do it. So you have to understand how to release that. And we'll take a look at that with injections.
Okay.